Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. This is another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And today we are going to mix it up a little bit. Going to go into my old corporate roots or business roots. We have our guest, she is an organizational psychologist. She has been presenting complex business concepts over the years, has a doctorate at the University of Virginia. She has worked at the MBA program at the Darden School there as well, has feedback from tens of thousands of participants who have worked in her programs throughout the years. And she is also the author of Woulda, Coulda, Shoulda, Rapid Results, No Excuses. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Margaret Bradley to the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I was excited about speaking with you because it's really interesting that in 2018 there is a lot of finger pointing and no one is taking ownership for if something goes wrong in business or life. And so I was really interested in speaking with you since your book is talking about woulda, coulda, shoulda. Seems like people are making excuses even more so than ever, and wanted to get your professional opinion on the current landscape of finger pointing.
I'm delighted you asked that question, and I'm glad that people are making excuses even more than ever. It really led to the book, Woulda, Coulda, Shoulda, because I listened to people around me and the excuses, and I listened to myself, and I realized that really one thing that everybody can do that would make them more successful right away without spending any time or any money is to stop excuses.
Where do you think, if we can kind of go back in time, because it seems there was a time where there was more ownership in decision making, and now, it seems like it's the total opposite. So everybody's pointing fingers at multiple people. Where do you think this started?
Well, some of the reasons that I think might have been behind that are a lot of decisions now seem to be made by committees, and it's easier to pass the blame. And I also think that a lot of people are not in their position as long as they used to be. So it's easier to blame their predecessor or turn a mess over to the successor with excuses. It's not my fault. It wasn't in the budget. The time wasn't right. All those things that we hear today and have heard for a while, but I think you're right. We hear them and read about them more than ever. What do you think?
Yeah, would you talk like just corporate pressure for, doing your job? Would you kind of throw all that in there too?
I would, and pressure for immediate results and short-term thinking. Again, I think that people are in jobs. The tenure is shorter in jobs, and I think that all of this contributes to excuses. And it's something that seems so obvious to stop making them, but it's also something that we're not taught. Maybe by our parents. In fact, it's interesting that the book, Woulda, Coulda, Shoulda, was really written originally for people in leadership positions. But I found that a lot of people have decided that, I might have an interest in excuses, but I really want to stop the excuses of the people who are around me, my family, my team, my organization. So I think that maybe, hopefully, there's more of an awareness. Although that hasn't stopped people, has it?
Well, let's go back because you've held multiple positions, so you've seen the different empowerment, if you will, on each level. So if you can kind of walk through what was it like with people on the front lines, the day-to-day, maybe customer service, all the way up to the boardroom.
I think one of the things that I really have enjoyed most about my career is just as you said, I've interacted with everybody from new employee orientation sessions through senior executives. And I think that one of the things that I learned, again, that led to the book, was that when I looked at the new ones, the experienced ones, the seasoned ones, or the ones who were just in there trying real hard to do the right thing, the number one thing in all of those people who were participants in classes or had been members of my team or I'd been members of theirs, the number one thing associated with being wildly successful is they didn't make excuses. And I also think, looking back on my career, some of the people who were less likely to make excuses were the ones who had been matched or matched themselves to being in the right job. They had a position that allowed them to use their strengths. And I also spent some time looking at different excuse styles that people have. And I found that those styles give you an indication of how frequently you make excuses and what your attitude toward excuses are. And, for example, the three styles are excuse conquistador, which would be well-suited to somebody who's sort of I'll make the plan, work the plan, and a military environment or a hierarchical environment. No excuses. Let's get it done. And the second one is a situational excuser who really says their favorite words are, it depends. And that's ideal for somebody in a research or a customer service background. You want them to have empathy for the customer, and you also want them to not make an excuse but figure out a reason behind the problem so that they can solve it. And the excuse optimizer is a little bit more cavalier and probably not as good a fit in a lot of business environments. That's basically someone who would be flexible. Well, actually, they'd be a great fit for a creative environment. So I think that the answer to your question is that matching yourself to the right environment, and that environment would be one that uses your strengths and that matches your excuse style. Just think of it for a moment. I'm not sure what your strengths are, but I know that I would like to think that some of mine are communication and creativity, but don't ask me to be the treasurer of your organization. That's when I'm going to start making excuses because it doesn't match what I do best.
Huh. So let's stay there with the strong suit with the communication and creativity. But when you said the treasury, right? I just remember in some environments you're told to take initiative, and you may be, or you're dressing and you're thinking about the next position. So if you come in as customer service, then you may one day want to be in leadership. So you may not have the strengths at that time, but what do you think about taking the initiative for opportunities that come up where you can grow into a strength?
I think that's great. I think that that's probably the key to success, because when you think about it, another key would be don't make excuses, plunge in. The number one reason that people make excuses is fear. I haven't done it before, or maybe I'm not sure that I can. But to plunge in and, as you said so well, take initiative. And I think another big factor is knowing what you want. And if you know that you're want to expand your horizons or have more responsibility, it's a great motivator and a great reason to take those risks. I recommend small ones, incremental ones, and setting yourself up for success, but definitely taking initiative. And if someone gives you an opportunity to be on a team or try out new ideas or initiate a project, go for it. Don't make an excuse.
When you were talking about being in part of the hiring process, and in the other part at the beginning, you were talking about the pressure for immediate results. One of the questions that usually happens that I can remember is, where do you see yourself in 5 years, or where do you see yourself growing in this position? And so there is a mindset of, am I seeing myself in 5 years? But if there's such a pressure for immediate results, aren't they kind of canceling each other out? Like, what's your take on that?
I think you're right. I think that what counts certainly is having a goal and having a personal mission, but right now is probably the most important if you're going to have any opportunities in the future. But I remember, I don't know if you do, I think it was a favorite interview question long ago, where do you see yourself 5 years from now? And I don't know because I haven't interviewed in a long time, but I imagine that people don't ask the question as frequently as they used to because the world is changing so quickly. I know when I entered the business world, people went to work for an employer and stayed there usually for their whole careers. And now experts say we're going to have not 7 to 9 different jobs, but 7 to 9 different careers. So I think you're right. Making up, what is a phrase I had coined, or a word I'd coined, be optimistic, a combination of optimistic and realistic. So the optimism is, yes, life is going to get better and better as I grow and do something perhaps even more rewarding 5 years from now, but be realistic at the same time and seize the day and make the most of your current position. Does that sound like what you remember?
It does. It was, a little nostalgic in what you were saying because my old firm, before they were acquired, we had a president who had started in the mailroom. And I remember when I had initially started working there and he was telling me that, right, I'm kind of sitting there like, are you serious? Am I watching a movie type of deal? And that was the case. But when they were acquired, that kind of went away. And then we were in an environment where you were saying that you may have 9 different careers, even in the same company. So.
Yes. And the company might not be the one that you originally joined.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was just also thinking, if we look at business cycles, about 10 years ago is when we had so much upheaval. And we're on a trajectory where where the impression is that it's a stronger economy, but it goes in cycles. So if we're due for another correction, if you will, there may be a lot more excuses going around because people are trying to adapt to maybe, like you said, a different career, and they're not going to be doing what they're doing now. If you were to look at your crystal ball and thinking about woulda, coulda, shoulda, and excuses, what would you say to the person for the next couple of years what they should anticipate and be prepared instead of reactive?
It seems overly simplistic for me to just answer your question by saying, wow, the world is changing, but the speed with which change is occurring takes my breath away. And I think corporations and individuals are facing those problems. I think that about 10 years ago, doing some consulting work with a major corporation, and they were laying off about 3,000 people. And I remember when I did workshops, which was Take Control of Your Career was the title of the workshop, that I quoted the past president who said that so many people had come up to him and said, "Oh, I want job security." And his response had been, the greatest job security in that day, 10 years ago, was being perceived as being able to do more than one thing. And I think the way that you're perceived as being able to be nimble, flexible, and rise to the occasion is enhancing your reputation by not making excuses. Sure, I'll learn how to, and I think of my own experience in information technology, and starting off with Fortran and punching cards in the basement of the science building at 3:00 in the morning, working on a degree, to now the age of mastering a program on my laptop, only to find out, I need to learn a new one, learn a new skill. So I think that being willing to take a risk. I went to a workshop not long ago, and one of the participants, who was very impressive, a law degree, or a graduate of a well-known, well-respected law school in 2014, terrific presence, very sharp. And he was saying, as a millennial, he said, I'm so disappointed. Nobody gave me a handbook for life. And I'm thinking, oops, I didn't know there was supposed to be one. And I think, in the handbook it would say, don't make excuses, go for it. But that's really hard. In fact, I conducted a workshop for senior executives in a company that was maybe similar to your experience. They were, it was a takeover, and they were actually in the larger side, the company that was acquiring another company, and they wanted to have some insights to managing change. And I asked them just easy questions, such as, where'd you go on vacation? When you go to a restaurant, where do you go? And this particular group was having a hard time with all of the changes that were taking place, because they went to the same place on vacation every single year. They went to the same favorite restaurant. They were not trying different cuisines. They were not trying different cities. And I think that you kind of need to learn to stretch and expect the unexpected. What do they say? Expect the best, but prepare for the worst?
It's interesting that you say that, because I'm looking back again at that 10 years ago, and there was an excuse, or not an excuse, but I think it was even an article, and they were talking about just what you were just saying, where we are creatures of habit. And so they had used an example of accountant, and they were working at a larger firm, and this accountant had hung out with all the other accountants at the office. They ate at their same restaurant for lunch, and went home. And then when they all were laid off, they were competing against each other, and they never really stretched those boundaries, like you said, to network with other industries or other people. And so they weren't seen as desirable for getting new jobs, because they were competing against others that were stretching themselves and out and networking and not being a creature of habit. So, what you were saying really struck a chord, because like you said, it's great to talk about it, and we may make excuses because we're creatures of habit and used to doing what if it's worked for the past 5 years, I'm going to keep doing it.
Yes. That whole idea of unlearning, not learning, but you've got to, not only do you have to learn new things, you have to unlearn the old ones. What worked, what was a wonderful title of a book, what got you here won't get you there.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, you need to stretch. And when you were talking about the networking with the accountants, one of the tips that I included in woulda, coulda, shoulda, to get rid of excuses, and maybe those accountants could have used it, is be careful who your friends are. And if you look at them, do they make excuses? Do they never take a risk? Do they say negative things? Do they hold on to the past? because it's been said that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Mm-hmm.
And you said those accountants worked together, socialized together, had lunch together, did not have other people in their close professional network. Big sort of red flag, danger sign. If you're all set, if those people are interesting, a little intellectually curious, highly motivated, but if they're in a rut, chances are you might be too. And in fact, I think one thing to ask yourself about the people with whom you spend the most time is, do they make excuses, and do they make excuses for you? I overheard one person who was starting a fitness and exercise regime trying to lose weight, and the friend in this narrow group of sort of negative people said, "Oh, don't lose weight. It's a terrible idea. Don't lose weight. You'll wrinkle." So to ask yourself, who are you spending time with? Are they negative? Are they holding back? And are they holding you back with an attitude that's kind of out of date?
Was that, Dr. Bradley, would you say that goes along with the pay attention to the power of language, to like those around you and what they're talking about and saying?
Exactly. I think that you said your words, the power of language, paying attention and just an awareness. And I think another tip that I'd like to share is if something isn't clear, or even if you think it is, the language may mean one thing to you and something else to the person who's speaking. Ask questions, ask for clarification, ask for details. It'll save you a lot of time and effort that might be wasted otherwise.
Good point.
So, and even if you think of a business example or a personal example, thank you, David, very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't make it. And if it's not just a social excuse, white lie, to talk about, you found out maybe as we talked that if I had some help on the project, or if I had transportation, or whatever the barrier is, we could overcome it together and move ahead. So yes, words count. And find out the meaning behind the words. And it can transform lives and transform careers. I know that I did, in doing interviews for the book Wouldacouldashoulda, I interviewed an attorney. And I said, do lawyers ever make excuses? And you all are being very polite, but he laughed as a lawyer and said, yes, we make lots of excuses. And I said, well, when are you most likely to make them? And he said he thought that attorneys made the most excuses when it came to excuses for not calling their clients back, not returning phone calls. And he listened to his own words, and he thought, I don't return phone calls. And I saw him a few weeks later, and he said, I thought about the words I said to you. I thought about the reason behind them. I realized that I didn't return the phone calls because I don't like my clients. And he resigned from the bar and started a new career.
Wow.
So you're right, an awareness and listening to your own words as well as those of other people can really lead to some very positive changes. And in this case, talk about a risk taker. The man is 68 years old and was told if you resign from the bar, you can't get back in unless you retake the bar exam, which would be unlikely that he'd want to do. So it was kind of a burn the ships, there's no way home unless you fight the battle. Put yourself in a position where you can't easily go back. Take a risk.
That's a good point and a good example, because we're always looking for ways to grow, and it doesn't stop at 25 or 35 or 45. In your example, this person may have been around people that were saying to him, you can't change careers, you can't, all the reasons, and making excuses not to. And just that little. One of our first podcasts was God winks, and it sounds like you had given that gentleman or a God wink to finding out what their next step would be. That was great.
Well, I love your title. I will have to go back and see if I can listen, because it's amazing that at one point I was running a career development program, and people would come in and say things like, I hate my job. I don't like what I do. I don't like the people. I don't like the setting. I really don't like the location, and keep on going. And but I think I'll stay here because I've only got another 17 years till retirement. And I'm thinking, do you know how long 17 years is? I think it's time to not make the excuses of, I'm afraid of change, or this is comfortable, or what. The known is easier than the unknown. And in fact, when you're thinking about mid-career or even late career, I used to teach a workshop, and the title was What to Do Before It's Too Late. And it was for mid-career employees who were also thinking about retiring maybe 10 years from then, because we found that people usually don't do new things in retirement. So if you say, I think I'm going to travel, and you've never even gone away for the weekend, it's kind of unlikely that you're going to do it. I think I'll buy season tickets to the theater. And in the last 40 years, you've never gone to a play. So I think I love your idea of God winks, but also be prepared and go for it now. Don't make excuses. Grab the opportunities, or, as you implied, create them yourself.
Yeah,
it's a lot easier said than done, I must admit.
Well, that brings me to the next point, because like you said in your workshop, What to Do Before It Is Too Late, for midlife or mid-career people, and you're saying that the speed of change is happening so quickly. And so if we can use a prototype of a person that, they kept their nose down kept their head down at, 20-something years old when they graduated, and they took some initiative, they grew in the company, and they're used to a standard of living and a good salary, and then the company was bought out. And so they're looking for work, and they're used to commanding the salary, but the marketplace is unable, or they can't find similar work. So without making excuses, what would you say as far as outlook and next steps?
I can empathize, and I had done outplacement programs for an employer who had major operations in extremely rural settings. So if you worked for that employer, life was good. And you probably had a farm that had been in the family for a few generations, and you made your living by working for this company. And suddenly the plant's closing down. And you can't say, dust off your resume and go someplace else, because there weren't other places. And I think that the answer to your question is it's difficult, but you really need to look at three things. You need to look at what are your values, what are your interests, and what are your strengths. And the values, one person said, I think I'm going to go reinvent myself, and I'm going to go back to school. And then he realized that second thought, he thought that he would look, this was not in the rural environment, this was in a city in which he had more options. He thought, I think I'm going to stay in my field because I have a young son who's having major medical problems, and I don't want to start a new career. So what are your values? And what do you do well? What are your marketable skills? And I think all of us have got some marketable skills. I know I have a degree that involves a part of the degree requirements for having a minor in statistics. I can do it, but I don't enjoy it. So I think you need to find out where the values, the interests, what do you like to do, and what do you do well, intersect. If you're lucky, you'll be able to find something locally. If not, I think you can regard yourself, it's been said so many times, almost as a brand, almost as what you incorporated, and figure out, are you willing to live any place, or maybe you're not willing to move? What is within an hour and a half drive of where you're living? And what are the employers looking for that you might have that is consistent with, again, values, strengths, and interests? That's the ideal world. If in a pinch, I think I'd start with strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I hope that all of your listeners are doing things like keeping a folder, or on their computer a folder, or a handwritten folder that has got evidence of accomplishments and things that they've done well, because you forget what you do right. I think, unfortunately, in the business world, if you do something wrong, that's when you hear about it. But you don't hear about it enough if you've done something right. And you need to remember what you've done right so you can build on those, both for your interviews and your resume, and even looking for the right opportunity. What are your strengths?
And you're in Virginia, correct?
Right. Yes.
It makes me, and this is probably just more of a statement, but I remember some colleagues, going through different changes in the what do you call it, DMV area. Right. And so some people, if they lived in D.C., they were able to take the train and work in New York. And so they didn't have to uproot their family. And I remember, we were sharing that story before, and I was talking about, wow, it would have been great if we had something like that here in Georgia. We're in Atlanta. And so it's so spread out that there has been talks of having like a rail system from Nashville to Birmingham, and that would be fruitful for the region. Right? You didn't have to. I just remember people. It was difficult if they couldn't sell their house, or your spouse could stay. Your spouse didn't have to leave their job, but you had to leave your job. It was just a lot of headache and heartache. Whereas in other areas of the country, namely like the DMV area, you could work in a region and not be uprooted. You don't have to take your kids out of school or anything.
It's amazing what people do. I went to an event yesterday and met someone who lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and commutes to New Orleans.
Wow.
That's a long commute. My father, for a while, lived in Norfolk, Virginia, and commuted to Minneapolis. That's not ideal. But I think one thing that's happened now, certainly since the days that my father did that, is if you're fortunate and don't want to move, that it seems that there are an increasing number of opportunities to work remotely. I know that some major employers decided that was not such a good idea after all and made people come back and work out of an office. But I think a large number of opportunities are still there. Again, if you have kept yourself flexible and up to date and have got the skills to be able, and the position that lends itself to doing that. But you're right. It's a long way. If you lose your job in Macon, Georgia, and have to, I found out Macon's not a suburb of Atlanta. It's a long commute.
Oh, that's funny.
You laugh because I thought it was for a while.
It's funny because here in Atlanta we have a joke that if you it's so the metro area has expanded so much, right, from suburbia to exurbia, that some people do live close to Macon, and they would say, if you see them on the plane, they're like, yeah, I live in Atlanta. So we said our metro area is called Nash-Lanaham.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Oh, I think that's great.
It was everyone complained about. David's originally from California, and I'm sure even in your area you complain about traffic. And so when you were talking about remote, I know some companies that they have some employees work remotely, and then just to stay competitive, they're on a 24-hour cycle, and that the Americans, if you will, work until like 6 or 7. And then from 7 on, they transfer all their business or their work over to India. And so I'm seeing more of that. And are you seeing that as well? And how does that factor in with excuses? Do you blame the people because of cultural barriers, or what are you seeing on that side?
Oh, what an interesting question. You're right, the world has changed. It used to be, congratulations, you're a new supervisor, here's your team, make sure you use eye contact and all those other interpersonal skills, and now the team might not be in the same time zone or the same country. And it's interesting. I would love to, now that you've prompted the question, look into different cultures. I had not considered that when I wrote the book, that maybe, thank you for suggesting it. I don't know the answer as far as different cultures. I do know that it's certainly, to make that situation you just described work, people have to embrace it wholeheartedly and not make excuses. The old ones of, I didn't get your phone call, don't work anymore. I didn't get your email, probably doesn't work either. Making sure that you have got a reputation for being reliable and following through, I would think would be even more important.
I didn't get your phone call one, always interesting, because in this day and age, you can't be anywhere it seems like everyone is surgically attached to their phones.
Exactly.
And the person that tells you that, you're thinking, that's funny, because when I'm around you, your phone, is in your hand constantly, yet you're telling me that you didn't get my call.
I know. So the old excuses don't work anymore. Also, people don't have the downtime they used to have, because I think that there's an expectation as far as excuses go. I make sure that I return a phone call or an email within 24 hours, right away if I possibly can. Do you think that most people do it even faster, or do you think that they've got sort of a 24-hour rule in their minds?
I think it depends on the position.
Okay.
But the other thing I would think of, and I've seen this with some of my attorney clients, namely personal injury, is that they're having more accidents. They're representing more people because they're texting and driving, or they're trying to conduct a conference call while they're in rush hour traffic, and it's like a DUI in that they're not focused. They're trying to drive with one hand and stay a part of the conference call on the other, and they don't want to make excuses that, hey, I'm sitting in traffic, I still want to be a part of the team. But I think something's going to have to give, because it's a challenge that we haven't had before. But with that 24-hour business cycle, I think these are some of the challenges we have to address.
So you're really saying it's better, certainly safer, to make an excuse. I'm terribly sorry, but I need to call you back in an hour. Is much better to make sure that you arrive at your destination safely. Isn't it, distracted driving? But you're right, you don't want to admit that I'm sitting in traffic or I'm in an airport and I'm paying more attention to another client. It's a big problem.
Yeah. And as adults, right? As adults, I think we're being hypocritical, because there's glowing commercials with major car brands where the kids are coming to their parents like, hey, I can't turn the volume up, and the parents are like, oh, really? Or my phone won't work when I'm in the car. And you're like, oh, really? And so what do you say when, Dad, well, you're doing that? It reminds me of the 80s drug commercials. Where did you learn that drug? I learned it from you, Dad.
I love that commercial. You're right, because even in our lives, the other night, my cell phone rang at about 10:30 my time, and I thought, gosh, I don't recognize PM, and I don't recognize the number, and I think it's probably going to be just a solicitation for something that I have no interest in, and they'll just hang up. And then it went to voicemail, so I thought, okay, I better check this. And it was a business call, but the business call was from Honolulu. And said, if you get this call, could you please call me back? And I'm thinking, okay, now it's almost 11 o'clock at night, my time, but I thought I can't make an excuse. I need to call this person back. So you're right, the downtime is hard, and the expectation across time zones and different situations, it's tough. It is tougher these days. I called it back, and I'm glad I did. But and then it led to a request of saying, "Could you please email me 3 documents right away?" So after midnight, I'm trying to find the documents and send them along because I didn't want to make an excuse, and I didn't want to admit that I was already wearing bunny slippers at that time of night and was not thinking in terms of business.
So let's stay there for a second. So we're talking about, I had used the example of different roles with kids versus their parents. And I want to get your take on making excuses as well. We're talking about, as employees or maybe small business owners. But on the other hand, on the other side, you have the CEOs. They're still getting these huge payouts if they're laid off or fired. And what's your take on that?
I'll take the easier part of the question first. How's that? When you mentioned kids, because I told you I wrote Wouldacouldashoulda, thinking that business leaders would probably like tips on eliminating excuses for their teams and from their teams, and I found that a lot of people have told me, I bought Wouldacouldashoulda for my kids, and or I've used it as a graduation gift, or sort of as you said with that other example we were just talking about, do as I say, not as I do. I might make excuses, but you shouldn't. The huge payout question, I think, is really interesting, and I don't really know the answer other than it's hard as someone who has not received a multi-million-dollar offer for a short tenure in a job without producing stellar results. It seems to me that it's kind of hard to accept it on the outside. I don't know how I would feel. Maybe grateful, maybe I'm not sure what. Usually, dismayed because what's my next opportunity? As you said, not thinking that it could happen to you. But I don't really know the answer to the payout. Do you have any insights?
Well, I was just, on one side with the woulda, coulda, shoulda, I know in the environments that I was in, morale is usually attached to the leader, right? So if the leader, and I was taught that way, if you're frowning walking down the aisle or, walking down the hallways, then your employees would pick up on that. And right. So, right, and it was just really interesting. I've been in sales. So, we've had mirrors on our desks and, make sure we're always smiling and such. But it was really interesting with my personal experience when I had left that one position and still hung out with some colleagues there, and they were just like, oh, man, we miss you being there. Like the person that's in your position, they don't smile. They don't call us by name. All of that is associated with morale. Mm-hmm. And so if the president it's top down, And if they bring in somebody from, outside the family, if you will, and they're there for less than a year, and they get this huge balloon payment and didn't make any type of change whatsoever, morale is affected negatively.
Oh, definitely. It's, I think it's difficult to be the person who's brought in, because I think what number that I had read just the other day was 40% of the outsiders who are brought into those positions don't make it. I think they fail in approximately a year, or less than a year.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also really tough on the team, because you're right, there is such a thing as leadership, and there is such a thing as culture. You're right, the smiling, what kind of a role model is the leader? I don't know, when you say, oh my gosh, well, next, that's not real good, is it?
I think it's just ongoing. It's something that we can't have a blanketed statement. It'll always change. But I'm thinking of clusters, and here in Georgia, we're trying to get a cluster. So around the country, you hear, or I've heard, we're trying to emulate Silicon Valley, or we're trying to replicate what's happening in Boston or DMV. And so in those areas, if I leave a place like Facebook, I can go to Google or Yahoo. And in the example you used earlier, I'm not saying Georgia's like that, but if we had that only one employer and then they go away, you're affected. Like here in Atlanta, we lost our Army base or military base, and that was a huge employer for around the airport and things like that, and that area is still adjusting, after 10 years. So what you're saying is at the beginning was really important about, short-term strategies and long-term, that strategic and tactical plans. I think you have to constantly evaluate them.
Oh, I agree. I think for your company, for your team, and for yourself. What's short-term, what's long-term. And I don't think that people, I guess the term that's most often used, stakeholders, employees, stockholders, your board, bosses, fellow or staff members, are really care about excuses for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
It's what are the results. Mm-hmm. And I knew the culture wasn't supportive, the time wasn't right, I didn't get the email. None of that worked. At least not in my experience. But you're right, it's particularly difficult when a major employer, especially someone like the Army. I mean, and on a lot of the major companies, no one would have guessed about the changes, or I certainly would never have been able to predict the changes that are happening. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that the excuse of who knew works anymore, although it certainly is something I can relate to. Oh, my gosh, or why didn't we pay attention? Because I think awareness has got to be part of it. I thought, another potential book is one on red flags and how to pay attention to the signals that maybe you just sort of made an excuse and thought, this didn't apply to me. Or it couldn't happen here. Oops, it did. And so not making excuses as far as being nimble and flexible. And I think probably my other career tip would be never stop learning. Because you just don't know what the future's going to have. Mm-hmm. And I think I told you that I mentioned that I wrote the book because I think one major thing that differentiates wildly successful people from average ones is that the wildly successful ones don't make excuses. But there's additional research done on what makes a successful person. And that research I thought was fascinating because they looked at all sorts of competencies and capabilities and education and experience. And the number one thing is not how educated you are or what your background is or what your grade was in high school in algebra, but the number one thing was, what are you willing to learn quickly? Do you learn quickly, but more to the point, do you learn from your mistakes? Do you not make excuses, but say, oops, okay, I'm not going to make that mistake again, and keep growing? So I thought that was encouraging, because that's something that I think we can all, is in everybody's reach. Learn from your mistakes. And learn, want to learn.
Well, that brings me back to my next question, because I've seen where a domino effect, like if something happens in one industry, it seems like it's in a silo, but then it's accepted, or you see it in other industries. And so over the past year, we've seen in the entertainment industry a lot of the dynamics changing with genders. And so they were making excuses before. And then since you have the IT background, right, you're working in something. Oh, you do not?
No, that's why I have to learn quickly.
Yeah.
I'm an amateur.
Well, yeah.
I'm an amateur.
Well, some of these male-dominated environments, right, they have to change. They have to change where, women or, people, diversity and what have you, it's constantly changing. So it's like you probably have a living, breathing document with the woulda, coulda, shoulda, because what was acceptable maybe 5 years ago isn't in 2018, 2020 type of deal. So it's more of like learning like you said, the competency, but also learning the intangibles.
Yes, and paying attention and doing the right thing. We just don't make excuses. I remember a real basic tip in an ethics course was, does it feel right? Would you be okay if this action were described on the front page of the newspaper and your mother read it? There's some real basic standards. So I guess in that case it was, sometimes it's a just do it and sometimes it's a just don't do it. And the world has changed. I know that my first job out of graduate school was I joined a major, huge employer, enormous. I think they had, 400,000 employees.
Wow.
And they, I did not realize that it was unusual to meet the president and be told, oh, we want you to develop, I'm smiling as I describe this, a Women in Management course, recruiting development program, because we don't have any women in management. And this was, in the late 70s. And I moved 800 miles away. I met the president my first day of work, which, again, I didn't realize how unusual that was at age 27. And he said, well, welcome to the company, and I just wanted to let you know the program's been canceled.
Oh, wow.
And for me and for the company, I think it all worked out very well, because the men said, well, we don't think that women should have an advantage and have a special program. So lucky for me, I was able to make a career out of really people in management. But times have changed for having a company of that, fortunately, a company that size. There's still industries where progress is slow on lots of different fronts. But I think people are not making excuses the way they used to, and are doing the right thing. I hope. If not, we have a book for them, right?
Yeah.
You were going to say something, David?
Yeah, I was going to ask Dr. Bradley, what do you mentioned in your book, you talk about excuses as gifts. Can you give me some examples of that?
I think if you find out the reason behind the excuse, you have taken a big step to solving a problem. And I think when I wrote those words that I thought about even staying in a hotel and having the comment cards, and instead of and not making excuses, tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like. In fact, you all are probably like me, and every time I do something online, I immediately take 2 minutes to give us the survey. Don't make an excuse and disappear. We want to know so we can fix it. And I think if you figure out the problem behind the excuse, you can move ahead and you can change your behavior. If you just kind of say, well, I'm sorry, I need an incomplete in that course, whatever the equivalent is in the business world, you need to find out what's really going on. I think that a humorous example is a true story of an excuse that a guy called in and talked to his boss and said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be at work today. And the boss said, well, what's going on? And he said, well, I'm having car trouble. And he said, well, what's the trouble with your car? And the man said, I'm not in it. So, and actually, when he probed his end, there was a problem on a project, and and he was afraid that he was going to come in, and because he wasn't going to make a good report at the staff meeting, but finding out what's behind the excuse, I think then it becomes a gift of information.
That sounds similar to the one of, I'm not going to be in today, and your manager asks, well, what's the problem? And you say, my eyes are bothering me. Well, what's wrong with your eyes? Say, I just don't see myself coming into work today.
I love it. That's wonderful. And then finding out what's going on. Is that just a fluke with that one person, or do you have a morale problem in the department? Could be a gift.
Yeah.
I think one of the big gifts, especially since your book is on Amazon, it is the comment section. Fortunately or unfortunately, if everyone likes something, they won't say anything. But if they don't, they can give you those excuses that are gifts that can actually either make a competing product or make your product even better.
That is an interesting dilemma right now. You're right. It's a scary gift, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a hold your breath gift.
Exactly. And I think again, it's the do the right thing. I would. What do they say? Feedback is the breakfast of champions. But I think there's a time and a place and a way to deliver it too, and to ask yourself what your objective is in offering it.
So if things are so fast, because we're at the top of the hour, I'm just thinking if they're so fast now, what do you see as far as can we get faster, or we're always looking for ways to improve, and how are we best able to adapt so that we find ourselves not making excuses for the future?
I think that keeping certain words in mind, excuses will always be there, opportunity won't. Kind of sums up our conversation today. Be aware. Listen. I think that people have told me that woulda, coulda, shoulda, if nothing else, made them aware of excuses that they didn't even realize were all around them. And I think keeping up with the fast pace, take a risk. Figure out what your strengths are. Figure out what you really, really want. And make it happen by getting rid of excuses would be my big word of advice.
Absolutely. And you can get your book on Amazon, but are there any other websites or social media where people can get in contact with you?
I laugh because we talked about computer skills. Right now, Amazon is the best place and the only place. So I would be delighted if your listeners go to Amazon and order Woulda, Coulda, Shoulda, Rapid Results, No Excuses. It's a small book that people tell me they've enjoyed using as a reference book and kept it by their bed. It's also fun to read. It's a lighthearted treatment of a serious topic. So I hope they'll find that it's got practical, useful tips, but I also hope that they'll smile when they read it.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, you have just been attuned to another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And Dr. Margaret Bradley, it was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Oh, thank you very, very much for inviting me to join you on your show.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Listen to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective on Radio Public. It's a free, easy-to-use app that helps listeners like you find and support shows like ours. When you listen to our show on Radio Public, we receive direct financial support every time you hear an episode. Experience our show in Radio Public today by listening to the show link in our episode notes, and thank you for listening.
Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.